He is remembered as the philosopher who declared that God was dead, who challenged morality, and who envisioned the rise of the Übermensch. But behind the force of his writing and the thunder of his ideas, there lived a man who fell deeply in love, not with an ideal, not with philosophy, but with a woman of flesh and blood. Her name was Andreas Salome. She was brilliant, fearless, and unconventional. Nietzsche saw in her the possibility of a kindred spirit, a companion who could share his intellectual passion. Instead, he faced rejection, humiliation, and the collapse of a friendship that once defined his life. This story revolves not only around Nietzsche, but also around and his close friend Paul Rie. It is a triangle of philosophy, love, and betrayal. And in the heart of it lie 3 letters Nietzsche wrote, each one more desperate than the last, revealing the vulnerability of a man who otherwise seemed unbreakable. In the early 1880s, Friedrich Nietzsche was 37 years old. He had resigned from his professorship at Basel due to failing health, plagued by migraines, eyesight problems, and nervous exhaustion. He was a wanderer, moving from city to city across Switzerland, Italy, and France, often in solitude, always writing. His books such as Human, All Too Human, and The Gay Science had begun to carve out a new path in philosophy. But they sold poorly. Nietzsche was largely unknown, his genius unrecognized, his health failing, and his loneliness profound. And then, in Rome, he encountered someone who seemed to change everything. Andreas Salome. Was born in St. Petersburg in 1861. The daughter of a Russian general, she grew up in an environment of privilege, but rejected its conventions. Restless, intelligent, and questioning, she left behind the strict religious world of her family and sought intellectual freedom. By her early 20s, she had studied in Zurich, engaged with theology and philosophy, and had already gained a reputation as a brilliant conversationalist. She was striking not only for her beauty, but for her fearlessness in discussing the most taboo subjects of the time: morality, sexuality, faith, and freedom. Would later marry Friedrich Karl Andreas, though their marriage was celibate. She would form relationships with the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, and later become a student, colleague, and friend of Sigmund Freud. She would eventually contribute significantly to early psychoanalysis. But when Nietzsche met her, she was just 21, a young woman in the intellectual circles of Europe, already making an impression, already impossible to ignore. The third figure in this story was Paul Rie, a philosopher born in 1849. Rie's work, especially his On the Origin of Moral Sensations, explored morality through a naturalistic and psychological lens, arguing that human morality had biological and social origins, not divine ones. Nietzsche admired Rie deeply. They shared ideas, challenged one another, and built a close intellectual friendship. Rie was calm, rational, and modest, the opposite of Nietzsche's fiery intensity. It was through Rie that Nietzsche first met and together the 3 of them formed what came to be called the Philosophers' Trio. Rie, and Nietzsche once discussed the possibility of forming an unconventional household, not a romantic union, but an intellectual one, a community devoted to thought, free from social expectations of marriage or domestic roles. They dreamed of living together in Berlin, in a house filled with books and conversations, where philosophy would be the foundation of life itself. For this was a vision of independence. For Nietzsche, however, it soon became something more personal, something far more intense. As Nietzsche's healings grew, he began to write to These letters, preserved in his correspondence, reveal the full weight of his longing. In his first proposal, Nietzsche spoke with admiration. He described her as someone who could stand beside him as an equal, someone who might save him from his loneliness. He wrote with cautious hope, presenting the idea of marriage not as an institution, but as a partnership of two thinkers. Lou declined gently, telling him that she valued him as a friend, but she could not marry. Nietzsche's second attempt was more urgent. His language grew more passionate, more insistent. He wrote of his suffering, his failing health, his desire for companionship in the midst of his intellectual struggle. Here Nietzsche revealed vulnerability, describing how much he needed her presence. Again, Lou refused. She valued freedom and independence above all else. She could not bind herself to him, not out of rejection of him alone, but out of rejection of the institution itself. The final proposal came after Nietzsche had already begun to feel the sting of rivalry with Paul Riesz. This third letter was full of desperation. He wrote almost with a tone of pleading, as if confessing that without her, his life would collapse further into solitude. In this final attempt, he seemed to recognize the inevitable, but still could not restrain himself from asking one last time. Lou's refusal was definitive. 3 times Nietzsche asked. 3 times Lou turned him away. And with that, the dream of their philosophical trio dissolved into bitterness. Nietzsche could not bear the rejection. His pride was wounded, but worse than that, his trust in Paul Riesz was shattered. Lou and Riesz appeared inseparable, and those scholars still debate whether their bond was romantic, Nietzsche saw it as a betrayal. By the end of 1882, Nietzsche had cut ties with both of them. The philosopher who had long struggled with isolation now plunged even deeper into loneliness. It was after this rupture that he wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book brimming with intensity, prophecy, and a rejection of pity and attachment. Some scholars see in this work the trace of his heartbreak, a transformation of personal pain into philosophical fire. Lou did not vanish from history. She went on to marry Friedrich Andreas in 1887, though the marriage was celibate, and she remained fiercely independent throughout her life. Her most famous relationship came with Rainer Maria Rilke, the young poet she mentored and loved. She shaped his artistic vision, and he, in turn, was transformed by her. Later, she joined the psychoanalytic movement and became one of Freud's earliest female students. She wrote about sexuality, the unconscious, and identity, subjects that connected her to the same themes that Nietzsche had wrestled with, though she pursued them through psychology rather than philosophy. Paul Riesz, after parting ways with Lou and Nietzsche, continued to write, but never achieved great fame. His work was overshadowed by Nietzsche's later recognition. In 1901, while hiking near Salome in Switzerland, Riesz fell from a cliff to his death. Some believed it was an accident, others whispered of suicide. His quiet end contrasted sharply with the explosive legacy of his 2 companions. For Nietzsche, the rejection was only one wound among many. His health continued to deteriorate, and his solitude became absolute. In January 1889, in Turin, Nietzsche collapsed in the street after throwing his arms around a horse that was being flogged. After that, his mental clarity never returned. He spent the final decade of his life in silence, cared for by his mother, and later his sister. During those years, his sister Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche manipulated his manuscripts, publishing distorted versions that later made him appear sympathetic to the ideology of the Nazis, a grotesque misuse of his legacy. The story of Nietzsche, Lou, and Riesz is not merely a love triangle. It is a story of philosophy colliding with passion, of ideals crushed by human desire, of genius humbled by rejection.